Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is Carrie from the Department of Higher Education. Really happy to have such a good group joining us today for this presentation on intimate partner violence on college campuses, and excited to have our partners at Miami University, Becca Getson and Kathy Wolney, joining us and taking the lead on this presentation. Just before we get started, I do want to make a note that the webinar is being recorded today. If you have not had a chance to mute your phone or your computer, if you just hit the little microphone button on your on the webinar presentation, it will mute you and the noises in your office from your computer at least. That will help us reduce the amount of background noise during the presentation, so those that want to listen to the webinar recording later do have the ability to get the full information that will be shared today. This is the first lead-in webinar to the Intimate Partner Violence Summit that will be taking place March 8th here in Columbus. Your campus point person has the information and the registration link, which was sent out yesterday for that summit. So if you are interested in attending or whatnot, you should definitely contact them at the conclusion of this webinar to see if there's any available spots still open for that summit. We will host another webinar next month on identifying unhealthy relationships, and that information will be sent out in the next couple weeks. But thank you again to those of you who have joined us today, and I will at this point then turn it over to Becca and Kathy from Miami University. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Carrie. This is with Miami University. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about domestic and dating violence and the power and control specifically in the campus community. So on our agenda today, a couple of things we're going to kind of review is the legislation and guidance documents. This is not intended to be have a whole lot of information. A lot of people have already talked about Title IX and Clery and all those kind of things. We're just going to kind of touch real briefly on those just because those do have such a great impact on the way the campuses respond to this. We'll also be talking about the basics of intimate partner violence, otherwise known as IPV. So some of those that general dynamics, then also specifically the college considerations. So that's going to be our focus today. So before we get into the content of this, I wanted to give us kind of a little bit of a brief background on kind of who we are, just so you know who's talking. So as I said, my name is Becca Getson. I am the Sexual Assault Response Coordinator and also Deputy Title IX Coordinator for students here at Miami University. I've been with Miami for almost 5 years at this point, and before that, I was an advocate with a shelter. So I've been with the work in the movement for about a dozen years now at this point. And I'm going to turn it over for Kathy to introduce herself.
Great, thanks, Becca. Hi, everyone. My name is Kathy Wolney, and I also work at Miami. I work out of our Office of Student Wellness as our Education and Outreach Coordinator, specifically for sexual and personal violence. So I've been here about a year and a half now, and that is when this position was actually first created. So I work a lot with Becca on prevention, as well as a lot of work on education. Specifically at Miami, we work with the It's On Us campaign a lot as our awareness and comprehensive campaign on all campuses. So I work with our students, staff, and faculty here in Oxford, which is our main campus, and then we've got a couple regional campuses over in Hamilton and Middletown that I work with as well. So what we want to cover is some of the main objectives of today. Just kind of reiterating what Becca talked about is first to understand university's guiding documents in the intimate partner violence field, both at the state and the federal level. So a quick logistical moving forward. I know a lot of people in this work commonly refer to it as intimate partner violence, sexual and interpersonal violence, SIV. For the remainder of this presentation, we will be referring to it as IPV to include sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, as well as stalking. We also want everyone to understand the basic elements of IPV, specifically, again, including dating domestic violence. And then where we're hoping to spend the bulk of our time this afternoon is understanding unique considerations for IPV on college campuses. So we know that college campuses is a very broad term, and that can look very different. So we're hoping to get into a little bit more detail on what that may look like on your college campus and important considerations to have in mind when doing this work.
Okay, so after that intro and our learning objectives, because we are higher ed, so we have to have our learning objectives, what we want to talk about real briefly at the front end is legislation and guidance. I like to make a quick note here. This is not intended to kind of provide all of the in-depth knowledge. I know there's a ton of resources out there for the legal requirements. So this is intended as an in-depth look. When we had initially talked to Carrie about doing this presentation, a lot of what we want to do here is kind of set the stage for the summit and just kind of provide some basic information. So we thought it was important to provide some information about the legislation and the guidance document. And I just want to make a quick note here, if you're not currently muted, if you guys could mute yourselves, that would be great, so that we're kind of getting some feedback there. Okay, so we're going to move on to some federal guidance. The federal guidance is, as you all probably are aware of, there are several big laws, so Title IX being one of them. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a deputy Title IX coordinator here at Miami, so I work a lot with Title IX, particularly on the response end, but also some of the prevention things as well. There's also Jean Cleary, and then also VAWA, or otherwise known as the Violence Against Women Act. It's important to note that all of these are separate laws, but also interact quite frequently with each other. I also want to note that this is not all the federal law that impacts our jobs. So this is some of the big ones that impacts the IPV work here on campus, but other things that could also come into play is FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, also HIPAA in terms of what those privacy rights are for health. So there are a whole bunch of other laws that might also impact the work that we do. So both Title IX and Jean Cleary deal with the response piece of it. VAWA also deals with response, but also some prevention as well. Okay. From there, we also have state laws, so not just the federal, but also some state considerations as well. One of the things that I often talk with our colleagues about across the nation is that Ohio has this felony reporting law. So that also impacts the work we're doing on campus and about whether or not we need to involve the police, what that reporting process looks like, and everyone also interprets that felony reporting law a little bit differently. So really looking at what your state says about this, what your own policy says, and how the university approaches it. There are also indications for child abuse reporting. So we often talk about higher education in terms of our 18 to 22-year-olds, but we have to recognize that there are also a whole bunch of non-traditional students as well, both over the age of 22, but also we have people on our campuses under the age of 18, whether they are initially starting or if you have groups that come on campus that are doing field trips or using our facilities on campus. And all those kind of things might also come into play when working with these laws and these issues and when thinking about how interpersonal violence and how you both respond and also prevent it. Last but not least, and I know that I'm assuming that most of us are in Ohio when we're talking about these, but keeping in mind what our criminal definitions are and what that jurisdictional piece looks like. So whether you have a campus police, whether you have a just your local jurisdiction you work with, or state. So those are also criminal definitions that come into play in regards to that as well. Okay. To add on to this, we also have some additional guidance that may not be law in terms of federal or state, but that we have provided some guidance from our OCR, from the Ohio Department of Education, the CDC. We also have state coalitions. We're actually very lucky in the state of Ohio to have both ODBN and OAESV, which is the Ohio Domestic Violence Network and the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. Although many of these aren't providing state or federal law, there's a lot of guidance out there on how to interpret those kind of things, and the Office of Civil Rights oversees the Title IX compliance. So although they are not providing the federal laws regarding it, they will provide guidance for that. As we know through your colleague letters and things like that, it may not be law, but it definitely provides some guidance for what those laws are. Oh, technical difficulties. Okay. So just kind of being aware of best practice versus compliance versus guidance. Those things might overlap. They might coordinate with each other, or there might be times where there might be disconnects between those, and really try to figure out, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, about how you kind of work on your campus with those instances, particularly where the federal law is not quite in alignment to what a best practice might be for that. Okay. I know I worked really quickly through that, and I want to make sure, are there any questions in regards to any of that, any of those topics before we move into the basics of intimate partner violence?
And this is Carrie, just to jump in here. I forgot to remind everybody, if you would like to pose a question, you should have a chat box on your screen. Please just direct that question to me or to the group if you want, and I will then read those questions and provide them back to the presenters so they don't have to worry about that while presenting. So if you do have a question, please just enter it in the chat box.
Great, thank you, Carrie. So we'll go ahead and move through that. So if there are questions about that first part, I know we worked through it really quickly. That was by design because there's a whole bunch of resources like I said already out there on it. So right now we're going to talk about the basics of intimate partner violence, including some definitions, cycle of abuse, and also those types of abuse as well. Okay. So first things first. With my background, I've worked in several different areas, and one of the things that comes out is just the differences in language that we use. We talk about domestic violence, dating violence, which technically isn't a crime yet in the state of Ohio, so that can also be kind of a disconnect when you're working with the criminal side of the house. Intimate partner violence, to talk about all those things in conjunction. At Miami, we use the term sexual and interpersonal violence to kind of encompass all of those kind of things that are going on. There are also other terms that you might use. So you at your own campus kind of need to kind of come up with that kind of what language you use and what kind of works best for your community. Other things to think about is what language you choose to use in regarding talking about those individuals that have experienced it or those individuals that are accused of committing one of these violations of these offenses. We put up some common terms that we tend to see, so whether it's victim, survivor, victim survivors, accused, offenders, perpetrators. There's also terms such as batterers. One important note when you're kind of working through this is kind of keeping in mind that there's a lot of background and history with a lot of these terms and what works best for your community. As a Title IX representative, it's important on my end of things to remain neutral and unbiased, but recognizing that using terms like alleged and things like that can also be charged, right? So it can be charged with a lot of background and a lot of history in regards to not being believed. So just being cognizant of what your university uses and being consistent as you can with what that looks like. Here, we're going to use the term victim survivors to refer to the person that has experienced these violations, and we'll typically use the term accused to refer to the person that has been accused or the accused person that's perpetrated these offenses. We're not saying that by any means is the only answer, but when we're talking about it, those are the terms that we'll be using to refer to those individuals. Okay. Perhaps this is my background, but one of the things that's really important, I've already mentioned it several times, is making sure to let your policy guide you. Adhering to your policy, utilizing the policy to make decisions, fall backing on that. So not only using it as your first way to kind of go around what you decide to do with a response when you hear about one or a report when you receive one, but really looking at what does your policy say and following that as best you can. Being sure to define everything is really important. One of the things that we've found to be really important in our policy is making sure that we're consistent with our language usage. So for example, there is someone who's a reporter, but there's also a victim survivor, and that could be the same person as a reporter. We also have complainants and respondents in our judicial office. We also have victim survivors who haven't reported anywhere else, so they're not reporters, but they're victim survivors. So just kind of being aware of what that terminology is and what that means for your policy and how that is referred to. Also being aware when you're talking about policy that there's a difference between higher education and criminal. So in the criminal realm, People are victims of offenses, and those are things that are important to kind of keep in mind, because when we're looking at it, we're not holding anyone guilty of anything. We're finding them responsible for policy violations, but they're not criminal acts. So when you're defining things, making sure that you're being aware of that. Same thing for sexual misconduct, sexual assault, and consent as well. So what does consent look like on your individual campus? As most of you may know, Ohio doesn't actually define consent, kind of gives a list of things that isn't consent. So when defining it, what that really means for your campus and what that looks like. And like I said, kind of falling back on that policy to make sure that you have the terms that you need and what terms each office uses. Because each office might also use different terminology for you. So being aware of that. Our Title IX officers use a little bit different terms than our judicial office does, just because of the way that the offices are laid out. So just being aware of that and making it very clear to those students and those faculty and staff that are accessing those offices that there is that difference there as best you can.
Okay, so we are going to move into some more of the basics, and wanted to talk a little bit about the cycle of violence here. And like Becca mentioned, right, there's a lot of language surrounding this and a lot of different terminology. But for here, when we're talking about the cycle of violence, we wanted to kind of give you a side-by-side of two different perspectives, what we're going to refer to as the victim survivor and then the accused. And we thought it would be helpful to see what this experience would look like from both sides. So we'll start here on the top right with this honeymoon phase, which occurs after the acute explosion. So in the honeymoon phase, we see from the victim survivor, we'll start with the accused. So from the accused, we'll see a lot of requests for forgiveness. They may offer presents, whether those be physical, emotional, things like gifts, flowers, jewelry, stuff like that, as well as making promises that things will be better. This was a one-time thing, making those promises excuses. And then from the victim survivor in this stage, we oftentimes see those attempts at forgiveness, to try to forget the event, to just move on, and to be hopeful for that future, because we see those promises being made from the accused. So looking forward, moving on from the past, and being reminded of the good in the relationship. So not dwelling on that acute explosion of violence, but focusing on the good, and a reminder to try to move on from that. And so as we continue through this cycle, we see the tension building again after the honeymoon phase. So we see criticism from the accused, and it could be in a variety of different ways. So we oftentimes see yelling, but we could alternatively see silence. So we could see that accused withdrawing from the relationship, putting strain on it in that sense. We may also see physical violence in terms of destroying property, or isolating themselves from the relationship and from the victim survivor. So as that tension builds from the victim survivor, again, similar to the honeymoon phase, we see attempts to calm the accused, again, to move away from this tension and to focus on the good in the relationship. So similar to the accused, we may see silence, we may see isolation, but we may also see the alternative, and that victim survivor being more talkative in those attempts to calm their partner in the relationship. We also see some external factors as well, so providing excuses, whether for themselves or to put up that external front to their friends and family and to other relationships. So providing those excuses, saying that, oh, you know, this is a one-time thing, this doesn't always happen. We often see that from the victim survivor, but internally there's the sense of walking on eggshells. So that fear that one wrong statement or one wrong movement, either saying something or not saying something, will lead to this acute explosion that they may have experienced before. So as we move through the cycle to that actual explosive phase of violence, that can come in a variety of different forms from the accused. So that may be a physical assault, it may be things like hitting, but we can also see other forms as well in terms of humiliating the victim survivor, threatening them either with physical abuse, or it may be more emotional or financial. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But from the victim survivor, we see a variety of different responses. Again, understanding that each person's response may be different. So there may be that reach out for support, whether that be calling the police or reaching out to support of family members, as well as others in the relationship, whether or not that be advocacy groups, resources on campus, or other things as well. We also, again, see that external front, those excuses for injury. But we may also see the individual fighting back. As this cycle continues, we may see the individual fighting back either physically or with words. And this may lead ultimately to the victim survivor to try to leave the relationship. However, we know in this work that in trying to leave a relationship, this is the most volatile time and most dangerous for this victim survivor. So understanding how that may affect a victim survivor, especially on a college campus, and understanding that it often takes several attempts to successfully leave the relationship. So another important thing to note about this cycle of violence before we move on is that the length of the honeymoon phase, as we continue to see this cycle build and repeat, is that this honeymoon phase will get shorter and shorter and shorter, and that we see tension building much more frequently and this acute explosion happening more frequently as well. So I know we talked a lot about the different types of abuse in this cycle. Something I mentioned before was that we may see physical, we may see emotional, but what is at the core of this abuse is the sense of power and control. So we're just going to briefly talk about this in a couple more slides. When we're talking about college considerations, we'll go a little bit more in depth and give some examples. But we wanted to make sure to note that at the root of all this, we see power and control, and we may see that coming to fruition in a variety of different ways. So we may see coercion and threats, like I mentioned before, intimidation. It could be emotional abuse. We also see isolation, so pulling away, using that isolation of the accused to kind of pull away their partner to gain that power and control back, as well as minimizing, denying, blaming, using the family, using support systems, as well as economic abuse, and using privilege of the accused or the alleged perpetrator. So it's important to note here that we see these all overlapping. We may see a variety of different types of these power and control. It's not a one over the other, but figuring out what the best way is and having the accused use those different forms of abuse, but again, the ultimate goal here is for them to gain that power and control back. So wanting to note that we see that in a variety of different methods. And before we get into our college considerations, we wanted to touch briefly on trauma. And from ODVN, pulling here that trauma is, or a hallmark of a traumatic experience, is that it typically overwhelms an individual mentally, emotionally, and physically. So again, noting that it's not just this physical that we see, and I think everyone in this work understands that we see it in a variety of different methods. But we wanted to spend a quick minute talking about triggers here as we move into our college considerations and what those may look like. So, understanding that everyone's response to a traumatic situation is very different, and there are a variety of different triggers that we see. So some examples including sounds, smells, specific colors, specific movements. Oftentimes we see sudden movements as something that may be triggering for an individual, as well as loud sounds or loud noises, or a specific sound that brings back that memory, as well as specific objects or significant events. So important to think here, there may be a certain type of the year that is especially difficult for a victim survivor, whether that be the start of the school year when we're thinking about academic calendars, or a significant event in their life, whether that be a new year, a birthday, an anniversary, things like that. So keeping all of this in mind as we move forward and talk about our college considerations, but what those triggers may look like and how they're very different for each individual victim survivor. So as we move into college considerations, we're happy to answer any questions if we have any. Otherwise, we will continue to move forward. Okay, so as we get into the bulk of our presentation and where we want to spend a decent amount of time, because I think that will be most relevant for all of us in higher education, is talking a little bit about considerations on college campuses, including our campus size, locations, different finances and resources, schedules for students on campus, as well as demographics. So it's important to note that kind of underlying all of these is to keep in mind policy. So that Becca talked about before, both at the federal and the state level, as well as policy within your individual institution. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the types of campuses and what that may look like. So we know here, and most people probably in the state of Ohio, that we have a variety of different types of college campuses, and those can affect the work that we're doing, both in our prevention and response. So things like the setting of our campus, right? Is it rural? Is it urban? Is it suburban? How does it affect how individuals are getting to campus, as well as the surrounding area, which may also affect the resources that we have, as well as a public or private institution, right? So what kind of policies do we have written into place, and how are resources delegated, maybe based on compliance, based on our federal and state policy? Where is that delegated, and what are the expectations that we do some of this work in? Another important consideration is our campus size. So are we a smaller institution, more medium, or are we a very large institution? Again, the resources that we have may be very affected here, as well as the policy. So keeping this in mind as we think about what work we can be doing, working within the parameters of our campus size and our resources. Most people outside of higher education, you know, when we throw out the term a college campus, often think of that 4-year institution, but we know that we have 2-year institutions, 4-year ones, as well as specialty campuses. So like I mentioned earlier, I work with our regional campuses as well, where we have a variety of associate's degrees. So we only have students for 2 years, and that obviously affects the work that we're doing in terms of how long we have to provide resources, education, and talk about our different policies as well as resources on campus. So something important to consider, how long your students will be on campus and how long you have to develop with them. Something else to note, town government initiatives, right? So do you have a close-knit relationship with your community? Are you in a large city? Are you in a smaller city? Here at Miami, our main campus is in Oxford, Ohio, and we're a relatively small town, and so our university and our community work very closely in collaboration to build sustainable relationships so that we can work with our community to access resources as well as bring them into conversations, as most of our students are interacting with our town on a regular basis. Another thing to consider in terms of your types of campus, are you residential or are you a commuter campus? So that comes into play a lot in terms of the physical location. Like I said, our regional campuses are more commuter campuses, so we have a lot more parking lots on campus, things to consider in terms of maybe where some of this violence may be occurring or where students are spending a lot of their time. So are there a lot of parking lots? Are there a lot of walkways, and are those well lit in terms of safety? As well as on residential campuses, we have dorm rooms to think about. Where are students hanging out? Where are they most interacting with each other? Moving on to affiliated versus non-affiliated campuses. Again, this comes into play when we're thinking about where our students are coming from, where their backgrounds are, and maybe what concepts and things growing up they had associated with, and where they're coming to the table as a college student. So that may affect, again, our policy. It may affect some resources as well as expectations of how these conversations and resources are to be had. Additionally, not traditional versus non-traditional students. So do we see students who are, again, when we say college campuses, that typical 18 to 24-year-old range? Or do we have more students that are more non-traditional in terms of their age? That's an important consideration specifically here at Miami that we talk about on our regional campuses. So we have a lot of individuals who may staff to campus to get additional degrees or degrees who are coming part-time, so they may be working full-time, they may have a family, and it's important to think about meeting our students where they're at, as well as is there a gap between our students and our staff? So what does our staff population look like in terms of interacting with our students? Is there a gap? How do we have those conversations, and how do we continue to develop that through the campus we have? And then finally, co-ed male-female. So again, what does our demographic look like? Does that affect our policy? Does it affect our resources? And who is interacting with each other? So those are some main points of campus that we wanted to talk about. There are probably more that we haven't covered. But again, remembering our policy underlying all this, how that's affecting not only our students, but our staff and our faculty, and the resources that we're able to provide.
Okay. Hope we're all doing okay. It's always strange when you're doing a webinar when you kind of can't see if everyone's doing okay and all those kind of things. So please ask questions as we're going along. I want to note, too, as well, we talk a lot about students, but keep in mind, too, that intermittent partner violence also affects our faculty and our staff. So when we're talking about Title IX, or we're talking about the interaction of the university or the higher ed institution with IPV, that we're also talking about our faculty and staff as well. So just kind of keeping that in mind. So we talked a little bit about campus and kind of what that looks like and how that might be. And we also want to look at the individual, right? What is the individual bringing? What is that experience? And looking at all of the different various pieces that an individual might be experiencing, might be bringing to the table, or might not have available. So we kind of outlined just a couple of things. As we were putting this together, we kept looking at having much more things, but we wanted to kind of keep it as streamlined as possible. So for example, you'll see on their demographics. That in and of itself could probably surround the entire student, right? Male, female, non-gender conforming, is this person identifies LGBTQI, and what those demographics might mean, especially in your relationship to the campus and the resources. Has someone, keeping with demographics, has someone told their parents that they are LGBTQI? Have they told their friends? Are they out? And what does that look like? And if they are, that might provide additional resources and services. If they're not, that provides additional ways actually that an accused might abuse that individual, right? Keeping that secret, not wanting to relay that information. It also makes a difference in terms of if they identify with the rest of the community. So oftentimes, and what we've been looking at here at Miami is our minority populations and how that might impact them accessing resources and services. So if they don't feel as if they're a member of the community, are they going to be willing to access that resource or that service, even if it is for them, even if that resource is for everyone? Do they feel comfortable accessing it? So for example, we have a Title IX coordinator. We have 2 deputies, one for our regional campuses and one for our main campus and our campus our international campus. If someone doesn't feel comfortable reaching out to the appropriate deputy, or do they feel as if they can reach out to anyone else, and who are they accessing? So that demographic piece can be really important. Same thing with our staff and our faculty. One of the really important things to kind of keep in mind is, are we presenting information as only accessible to students? I still feel that I'm relatively new to higher education, even though I've been here for 4.5, 5 years at this point. And every once in a while you still run across, is this for me, right? Am I allowed to go to this, or is this just for a student? And I think we can very easily kind of think about our services and our supports, our resources, as being very student-driven, but kind of keeping in mind that faculty and staff also have needs, and being able to make sure that they can also identify where that is. So that kind of goes to that support system and what that person might have. When we're thinking about support system as well, we also want to kind of keep in mind where that support system is. Do they have friends on campus? Did this happen the first week and now they're kind of isolated and they now don't feel connected to campus and don't have any friends on campus? Are they looking for that support system? Are they, do they live in Hawaii or Alaska and they've come to campus here, or come to college here, and now everyone that they've known are hundreds or thousands of miles away? So where is that support system? How can we help them access that a little bit more as well? Can also be helpful. Financial stability has a huge impact. If someone is concerned that reporting this or accessing resources will impact that financial, does the accused individual have access to the financial? One of the things that I run across quite frequently is we have swipe cards here on campus that give them access to their meal plans, to their residence halls. Basically, if you have your swipe card, you'll be able to do pretty much anything you need to. If you don't, then you can't access your residence hall, you can't access your room in the residence hall, and you can't get fed. So that's a huge impact. So if someone takes that away from them, that can really impact that. Another thing, too, is whether or not their parents know and what their parents are paying for. So if they were to report it and suddenly their parents become aware, are they going to lose that support? We know that it's not their fault that this has happened to a victim survivor, but the parent impact can also be very huge in terms of that financial stability. Social life is really important. So I know we've got kind of the academics on the other side of the house, but the social life is also important. And how is that impacting? Are they feeling safe going out? Where do they go out? Here in Oxford, and every community is different, but we have an uptown where our students will oftentimes go. Our faculty and staff, if you're curious, probably don't go up there. Usually they don't, so we don't tend to see them up there. But our students access that. It's also a really small town, so although we are kind of a medium-sized university, our town is pretty small. So in terms of getting off campus, it's a pretty small area for them to go. So if they want to feel safe, they're really a little bit more limited in where they can go and where they can have fun. In terms of, even if they just want to go see a movie, really limited in where that's going to be. And if they do find that location where they can go, it's very likely then that they would run into someone that they would know, or that the accused would also know that location as well, because there's not that many options for them. Class schedules, of course, this is kind of one of those obvious kind of things, but one that sometimes we kind of forget about is make sure not only do they not have classes in common, right, some of the academic pieces, but are they in the same building? Do they have to access the same location in order to go there? Do they take the same routes to classes, and what that kind of schedule looks like? And then on the right-hand side, and we've kind of included a lot of these together, work, academic, housing, and transportation is kind of the big four that the Dear Colleague letter talks a lot about, and that Title IX kind of looks specifically at in terms of are they working in the same location? Are they in the same department or office? Where are they housed? Is it on campus? Is it off campus? Is it in the same quad? And all those kind of different things. Last but not least is social media and what impact social media has. As we are all aware, social media is huge. Some of us are more aware, and I put myself in not as aware category of all the social media that's out there and that's available. Occasionally that can make investigations a lot easier, because we can actually get written documentation or pictures of things happening. But oftentimes there's a lot of shaming that happens on social media. That might also be a helpful support system that people might have that they aren't really aware of. But that could be a helpful support system in terms of getting that kind of social interaction if they aren't quite feeling comfortable doing that in person. Okay. So that's the individual experience. And I'm going to hand it back over to Kathy to talk a little bit about what she talked about earlier.
Perfect. Thank you, Becca. So Right, like I said, hopefully this graphic looks a little bit familiar, this time with some added verbiage here. But again, moving back and talking about power and control that we see from the accused, and what that specifically looks like on our college campuses, right? So we talked about different types of campuses, and we know that maybe people outside of higher education, when they say college campus, think of this very narrow term, but we know that there's a broad spectrum of what those campuses can look like. But again, we want some important considerations that most colleges can take in terms of when we see this power and control and these different types, what that looks like. So we'll start here at the top with coercion and threats. And again, what this may look like depending on the different colleges, but what we oftentimes see is phrases like, I'll give you a better grade. If they're a professor, maybe a graduate assistant, somebody who has control over their academics, using that again to gain that power and control. Or if they're not in that position, threatening to tell their professor or tell their advisor. So we see a lot of coercion or threats in terms of academics in the college environment. Similarly, as we move over to intimidation, maybe we see that disparity in class here. So there may be someone who is an upperclassman and is using that in terms of gaining power. They may share an organization, or there may be that disparity in social status. So when thinking about our campus here in Oxford, we have a pretty large Greek life as well as athletic organizations, both at our varsity Division I level as well as our student orgs and our club sports. And so those are very big organizations where, again, we may see a lot of overlap between students and using their power in those organizations to intimidate the victim survivor, as well as emotional abuse. So again, thinking about academics here, maybe criticism for grades, for receiving poor grades, or access to specialized services. So to tutoring services that you may have on campus, different services, right, depending on the university. Through emotional abuse, maybe that forced sharing of passwords. So Becca talked earlier about social media and what that may look like. But on college campuses specifically, are they forced sharing passwords of maybe access to their academic grades, right? So how are they seeing their grades? Do they have access to that? And can they go in and utilize that through this emotional abuse? And that leads into isolation as well, right? So Becca talked earlier about swipe cards being a big thing here at Miami in terms of accessing basically everything a student may need, from their residence hall to food to their room. So are they using access to residence halls? Maybe they have access to directories to get in contact with friends and to pull that victim survivor away from their support system to continue to isolate them. They may also have access to their schedule, right? So again, if they've got that sharing of passwords, what are all the different aspects that they can access and see specifically as a student on a college campus? We see a lot of times here at the bottom, minimizing, denying, or blaming. So that may look like blaming a partner for their poor performance, again, whether that be in a social setting or in academics. So again, talking about athletics, maybe being involved in organizations, not being nominated or not getting a position of social status. We may see the individual telling them that no one will believe them, right? So again, kind of going back to that intimidation and that threatening behavior, minimizing the victim survivor and letting them know that nobody will believe them. As well as using family. So using family, using support systems. Again, this is where FERPA comes into play, as well as HIPAA. Thinking about, do parents have access to records? Do they have knowledge of the student's social life, right? So we talked about earlier here at Miami, a lot of social life occurs in our town, in our small town and uptown. You know, what is the parents' knowledge of that? Do they know what your campus looks like? Do they know what resources there are, and then do they have access to records, right? So has the student granted access to the parents, access for their records, and what records can they see, right? So for do they have access to their academic records, things of that nature. And then when we move into economic abuse, we talked a little bit about financial stability earlier and what that looks like, but threatening the loss of a lease, right? So are the partners living together? Is the landlord involved? You know, how is that power and control coming into play there? As well as threatening scholarships, right? So does the accused have access to their scholarships, to their financial aid? And again, looking at swipe cards, right? So that may be different on different universities, but swipe cards specifically here at Miami, right? If you take that away, we're taking away a lot of that financial freedom for our victim survivor. And then our last bubble here, privilege, when we're talking again about social groups, so are they in a position of power where they can use access to social groups? That coincides a lot with the bubble directly across, right? So isolation. Are they using that to isolate them, to pull them away from social groups? Or are they threatening their ability, not only in college campuses, but moving forward to get a job, to get an internship, or to tamper their image moving forward? So all important things to think about in terms of how the accused is gaining that power and control, specifically on our college campuses.
Okay, so in our last final minutes of content here, we're going to kind of take everything that we've just talked about and kind of that overview of what IPV is and kind of some college considerations and look at applying it to your own university. So we have our little college map here that is to scale, by the way, just if you're all curious. And what we're looking at here, right, is looking at your college individually. And I think one of the both exciting yet frustrating parts is that sometimes when we ask like what we should do, the answer is always it depends, right? Because every university is so different. Even for us with our multiple campuses, those campuses look different and require different things. So where are those classes and events that are happening? You have only the one road, right, that's coming in and out. Where are the places that particularly that are only one place to go for? So for example, do you only have one dining hall? You have one dining hall in one place, but then the other one is really far away, and also the students hate that other one, so they're never going to use it anyways, right? So kind of taking those kind of considerations in. What is the one-stop shops for places that can be really helpful for students, but also may result in kind of this bottlenecking that will end up with the partners in the same place, or that they have to access, right? So I think a lot of times we look at focusing our efforts, making sure that students don't have to go all over the place, which is great for them and I think really helps. On the other hand, I think that also creates this location that a accused may absolutely know then where a victim survivor may need to be, or where they both have to access, right? Schools have only one dean of students, right? So when you have one dean of students, if they both need to access that one individual, that gets a little tricky in terms of that. Financial aid or the housing office, all those kind of things. So really thinking through what are those one-stop places. Having spoken with a lot of colleagues, usually there's only one stop for most things, right? In terms of offices or individuals to kind of work with that. So just being cognizant of that. Really thinking through where do they need to report, what that location looks like, how do people get there, and what those kind of on-the-ground things are. What are those common spaces? Do you have a student union? I absolutely love we have a new student union here on campus, relatively new, and it's all glass, right? So even if someone were to access a student union at one location, they could still then see the other person on campus, right? So it's very open and light and airy, but it does create a little more tension there if you're trying to avoid someone. Where do the parties live? Is it on campus? Is it off campus? Where do they park their cars? If you're a smaller campus that only has one parking location, or if you're probably like the majority of us, if you have multiple parking locations but you can't find a parking spot anyways, where do they end up parking and what does that look like? Where do they spend their free time? I know sometimes this can also be hard because we provide programming for students to be able to access. So where are we giving them that time to be able to spend, but also where are they spending it in and of themselves, right? So where are they doing their social time? And typically there are a couple of places that are the cool places to go, and that students, faculty, and staff access more than other locations. And then once again, what are those resources that are specific to your campus? So really taking a close look at all those kind of on-the-ground things in terms of what a student goes through on a regular basis. Okay, so with that whirlwind of this is what IPV is, and these are some college considerations, we've kind of concluded our content. So we have our contact information up here. We'd be happy to take questions for the next little bit. We also have our contact information here if you would like to reach out to us individually. We'd be happy to address any questions you might have after this fact as well.
If anybody has questions, I haven't seen any in the chat box yet, but as Becca said, her and Kathy's contact information is up on the screen, so definitely we'll encourage you to send them to them. Thank you, everybody, for your participation today. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Becca, for your time and your expertise. Everyone, a recording of this webinar will be available after we wrap up here in a second. Just email me if you'd like a copy of that to share with other colleagues at your campus who are unable to make it today, or if you yourself just want to review it. Still not seeing any questions come in, so I want to thank everybody once again for your participation today. Hopefully we'll see you in March at the summit, and have a great day. Thank you.